Welcome to the G5 Hive and our next installment of our Worker Bee series, where we deep dive into the G5 college football landscapes with the folks that know the teams the best. If you're watching us on YouTube, please hit that like and subscribe button, and if you're listening to us in podcast form, please leave a rate and review. Today we'll be taking a look at the UTSA Roadrunners who finished 9-4 last year and capped off their season with a 35-17 win over Marshall in the Frisco Bowl. They wrapped up their 2024 spring practice with their spring game on April 13th. Today we have a special guest joining us today. He is a UTSA beat reporter for the Express News and has never met a Haley Williams song he didn't like. He is Greg Luca. He can be found at Greg Luca on X. Welcome to the show, Greg.
Hey, thank you guys for having me. That's a very appropriate and accurate introduction. So I'm excited to be here talking some UTSA football with you guys.
All right.
We're glad to have you.
Tell us a little bit about yourself and what led you into journalism and ended up covering UTSA athletics.
Yeah, I've kind of covered a lot of the country just with my sort of path here. I grew up in Connecticut and kind of just identified as a kid, sports are fun and it would be great to do it from the journalism side because certainly wasn't athletic enough to get anywhere close to that. And so then went to the University of Florida, got a journalism degree there in 2013. First job was a few hours south of here in the Rio Grande Valley, and then I have been here covering UTSA since October 2018. So it was a good time to get into this program because you got to see sort of the lows and the way things were in the last year and a half or so under Frank Wilson and the come up that they've been on here since Jeff Traylor took over in 2020.
Let's get to the position where it all starts on offense, and that is the quarterback. Last season, we got to look into the future as Frank Harris battled injuries. So we got to see both Eddie Lee Marburger and Owen McCown both get some starts last season. As the season went on, Owen became that fill-in for Frank Harris. How did Owen and Eddie Lee look in the spring?
It's interesting. You guys have talked to enough teams at this point that I think you're pretty aware of how coaches discuss these sort of things. It's always that everybody's even and it's a total competition and they're sharing snaps. And I think that they probably split the snaps relatively evenly through the spring, but it has seemed pretty evident for most of the fall that Owen McCown had sort of surpassed Eddie Lee Marburger on the depth chart. When Owen came in the second half against Tennessee and played pretty well. And then when they needed a spot starter in the bowl game, he was the guy. And it seemed like he was second on the depth chart everywhere in between. So coming in as a transfer from Colorado, he probably had a little bit of work to do to get up to speed in the offense the way Eddie Lee was. But eventually it seems like he got there. And now I would expect that he will be the guy going into the fall. They'll along the same lines, they'll tell you these guys are very similar players. They don't want anybody jumping in the transfer portal or thinking that they're behind. But generally, it seems like Owen is a more kind of technical, maybe timing-based, fits the system of the offense kind of passer, whereas Eddie Lee has been described as more of like a gunslinger, kind of more improvisational and kind of make things happen that way. So stylistically, there might be a little bit of a difference, and I don't know if that favors one or the other. It's probably all about how you can produce at the end of the day, but right now it seems like Owen is that guy. So I would expect him to be the one with the job. And, in the spring, the parts we saw, they looked even, but I just think the track record at this point tells you that Owen's the guy who's in the front for that spot.
So fairly recently, I guess maybe towards the end of last week, they brought in they got a commitment from a transfer quarterback, Demetrius Davis, formerly of Auburn, but most recently from Alabama State. What should we make of that signing or commitment, I guess?
Yeah, it's interesting to hear the way they've talked about this position, because you go all the way back to signing day towards the end of last fall, and Jeff Traylor basically said, we told all the quarterbacks we talked to, if you want to come in here, you better expect that you're going to have to compete with Owen and Eddie Lee, and if you think you can beat them, then come on in, and if not, then maybe you should look somewhere else. And I don't know how exactly harsh he really was with all these guys, but I do think that it's pretty obvious that they didn't get somebody in that cycle, and they didn't get somebody ahead of the spring signing day, and so we knew based on the fact that they had been looking, that they were still looking for another experienced option who could, whether it's push those guys, which it might be, or at least give them another option who's seen college snaps before. So Davis, I think when you just look at his stats and what he's done at Alabama State, I obviously wasn't following it all too closely, but it doesn't seem like production-wise he'd be ready to step in and compete with those guys at the level that they're able to play at, especially having more time in the offense and understanding how things work. But you just never really know how a guy might click with a new system, or a coach might unlock something in him. So I wouldn't say it's impossible, but right now it looks like he probably enters the year third on the depth chart pretty comfortably.
So it sounds like Owen's probably the starter heading into 2024. But what would happen, you think, where what would he have to do or not do maybe to where you see a quarterback change and a switch to Eddie Lee?
Yeah, it's tough to say because Frank Harris was so entrenched the last couple of years that it never really came up. But if you go back to during Traylor's early seasons, when they were still sort of feeling out whether Frank was that guy and what that might look like going forward in the program, they were not afraid to turn to another option or give other guys opportunities. And even last year when Eddie Lee started against Tennessee and they went to 0 at halftime, it seems like, I don't want to say they have like a quick hook for guys or whatever the case may be, but it seems like they're certainly open to the possibility of making a change if needed. At the same time, you don't want guys kind of looking over their shoulder and things like that. So it'll probably depend how much of a gap gets created in the fall. But if it really ends up being a tough decision through camp, and there really is some thought that maybe Eddie Lee is actually the better option to begin with, then it could be a pretty tight leash. I imagine opening with Kennesaw State, you would think that UTSA would have a pretty easy time in that game. So that could be a path for Owen to sort of build up some confidence and some bolster his standing a little bit, where it might be harder to him out and make a change. And then that could carry through any tough matchups that might lie ahead. But yeah, it'll be really interesting to see. It's hard to say.
Moving on to the running game, the Roadrunners bring back their top 3 rushers from 2023 in Kavarian Barnes, Robert Henry, and Rocco Griffin. How did that room look in the spring?
I think that's a group that everybody should be really confident in. I feel like those 3 guys have all proven that they can be pretty productive. And when 1 or 2 of them might have been banged up at different times last year, they turned it over to the other guys to just keep the offense moving. So that running back position, I think, is one that everybody at this point of the year should feel pretty confident in. And, it's no wonder that anybody that they add to that room is just a bonus. I think they're in a good spot there.
All right, talking about adding to that room, what should we make of the recent transfers? Former Texas Tech running back Bryson Donnell and incoming freshman, just a late flip here in Frankie Arthur.
Yeah, I'm not really sure how either guy is going to stack up. I think, if anything, it's an insurance policy, and then we'll see how the development process plays out. But you never know with the running back position in particular. It's so easy for guys to get banged up, and they love having a bunch of guys they can rotate. They've wanted to play more in the years past than they've been able to because of that injury situation. So all it takes is one guy to go down, and then you start seeing the 3rd and 4th guy get in the mix, and then it could end up that they make a pretty big impact. But from a talent standpoint, it's hard to say how they exactly stack up. And there's always everything you have to learn in a new system with, understanding your pass blocking and all the things that people might overlook initially.
So you have those 3 coming back, then you add these 2 incoming freshmen and transfer. What kind of split do you think we're going to see from this team in 2024?
Yeah, it's a really interesting scenario because it seemed like Kavarian Barnes, coming away from his freshman season 2 years ago, had really emerged as the guy. And he's still had a really solid season last year, but if you're kind of nitpicking or trying to separate all the guys, it seemed like he was carrying a little bit more weight and might have been less dynamic or explosive compared to his first season. And he had a couple issues with fumbles too. So by the end of the year, I think And even at different points during the season, it felt like Robert Henry was the guy who gave defenses the most issues, where it was just like, how are we going to tackle this guy on a play-to-play basis? And, Rocco's a very solid player, and if he's faster than the other guys, maybe it's not by that much, maybe just a little bit, but he doesn't seem to run with the same ferocity as the other two options. So we might see more and more Robert Henry, but we could see if Kavorian Barnes comes in looking a little bit more like he looked as a freshman, then maybe he ends up being the guy. But I just don't think there's a wrong answer. It's probably the benefit for UTSA. However it shakes out, they should feel pretty good about who's back there.
When you saw Barnes in the spring, did he look similar to his 2023 self or his freshman year?
He was not really going full speed, so it's very hard to say. I think he was kind of limited by injury and just some stuff that you just don't need to put any extra miles on a running back at that time of the year unless he's 100%. So we didn't really see him kind of out there in the mix as much as some of the other guys.
So last year you talked about, Henry being that tough guy to tackle. Well, he almost doubled up Barnes and Griffin in the touchdown department. Is that something that you think we might see again here in 2024?
Yeah, I think he was pretty safe with the ball in terms of the not fumbling it away in those critical situations, and obviously had the propensity to fight for those extra yards and force his way into the end zone in those goal line situations. So I do feel like when they're down low, I think he's probably the guy they'll go to most regularly. If Kavorian or Rocco was going to score, it's more likely to be one of those 20-plus yard carries. And we saw them do that a few times last year and over their careers. But I think probably down near the goal line, Robert Henry would be the guy you'll see more often. So I think that could translate into more touchdowns.
All right. So given that you are the head coach for UTSA, you're trying to get into the playoffs. You're inside the 10-yard line. You got 4 rushes to score a touchdown. Who is the one guy that's going to get all 4 touches?
Yeah, I think it's Robert Henry. I think it's got to be. But the good news is, like you talk about with the running back position, it's all about the fresh legs too, right? So if you need to give it to more than one guy, Kavorian's perfectly capable of being that kind of a physical bruiser. But I just think Robert Henry's more likely to be the guy who doesn't take no for an answer and kind of gets there.
All right, moving over back to the passing game, UTSA lost their top 2 leading receivers in 2023 due to graduation. Joshua Cephas off to the Jacksonville Jaguars, and Tyke Ogle-Kellogg graduated. They do bring back freshman sensation Devin McEwen, Willie McCoy, and others. And let's not forget about a name people may have forgotten about, and that's DeCorian or JT Clark. In an article he wrote mid-November of 2023, he said that Clark would be out for a minimum of 10 months. So that kind of puts it like early, September timeframe. What can you tell about his recovery from that second knee surgery, and when do you realistically think we should see him back on the field?
Yeah, Clark's recovery is a really funny situation because that's probably the wrong word, but it's been intriguing because we spent all last year thinking his full return could come at some point in that 2023 season. And that was the case. We were kind of figuring out, through the spring when that would be and through fall camp when that would be. And he actually was on the field playing some snaps and some low red zone situations early last year. And the final stages of the recovery just didn't seem to progress the way that they had hoped, where he felt fully comfortable making some clean cuts and some of the lateral movement. And so ultimately, I think that's why they decided on that second procedure. So now coming back this year, when we go through the same kind of routine and I ask people, like, when's he going to be back or how's it look? They're like, well, we weren't lying to you last time. We thought he'd be back. But now that we've kind of seen this go haywire once, I don't know if we even want to try to put a timetable on it. You know what I mean? Like, they rather just see and hope. So we'll probably look at that 10-month time frame, which would put you kind of early in the season. And around, we'll be asking and we'll see what happens. But I think what we've learned is he seems, instead of being doubly discouraged or feeling like this was a setback, it seems like he's more confident in the outcome of the procedure and more ready to kind of get back on track. So I think that we will see him at some point. I'd be shocked if we didn't, but when is still a very, very difficult question.
So I'm going to assume it's probably a safe assumption that when he is ready, they're probably just going to ease him back into things versus sending him out there 100% from the get-go.
Yeah, I think that's what they wanted to do last year as well. We saw when they were going to put him in, it was those situations where he'd be more likely to just kind of go for a jump ball in the end zone, some of those close in kind of things. And that's because you don't really have to make the same kind of cuts and movement across the field laterally. And so I think maybe whenever he's ready, you might see that same kind of progression where he eases in that way and then expands to the full menu of offense, unless he's just that ready once the season gets here, which would be kind of a miracle. But I do think, you'll probably see some progression in that sense.
All right, well, let's get to the rest of the receivers. How did the rest of those guys look in the spring?
You know, it's funny when you were doing the, you guys sent me the little outline and you were just telling us about the past, and I was ready to send you a correction. There's no way Tyke was the second leading receiver, because it felt like Devin McEwen had established himself as that guy and as a real threat. But I think that really speaks to Tyke was not a guy that necessarily from year to year or game to game you felt like you were going to get that consistent level of production or that you could super rely on compared to some of the other guys. And McEwen, on the other hand, even though the end result wasn't as high of a total as what Tyke was able to put together, for him to come in as a freshman and do what he did was really kind of a revelation for this team. And it was really fast, just looked ready to play at the college level. And when you look at this receiver room overall this year, when you have Devin, of course, and then you have Willie McCoy, and you have Chris Carpenter, and you have DJ Allen, the transfer from TCU. It's a lot of guys who are right about 6 foot. They're really fast. So the speed is what sort of sets that room apart. And then to round out that room, they have the size threat in JJ Sparkman, who comes in and is kind of replacing. And whether JT Clark comes back and is that guy as well, but right now it looks like JJ Sparkman is kind of that replacement for the taller target who you can kind of throw it up to and he can make a play. And we saw him do that a couple times in the spring game. So overall, I would say the outlook for the room is pretty strong. We will see, because you don't need all of those guys to be great, right? But if you can get a couple of them to rise up to the level that McEwen is at, and one of the, whether it's Sparkman delivers the way it seems like he has the potential to, or if JT comes back and to provide that different style of threat, then I think they have a pretty well-rounded room there that can stretch teams vertically potentially.
So you talked about transfer JJ Sparkman and what kind of role we might see from him in 2024. But what about the TCU transfer, DJ Allen? What do you think maybe they have in store for him for 2024?
Yeah, I know. Obviously, they spoke highly of him, as they do of just about everybody this time of year. But I think probably more of a me problem than a him problem. But I didn't see him jump out in the spring practice the way some of the other guys did. So I don't know if that maybe lowers the expectations or not, just for me personally. But they've said really strong things about how he's just as fast as anybody else in that group, and I think could easily end up finding a role. I just find it a little bit harder to project because he didn't make a lot of these standout plays that I might have seen where some other guys, you look at the sheet and say, oh gosh, who was that? So yeah. I think maybe we see any number of guys emerge, or the depth chart could shake out any number of ways. But right now, Sparkman is the one of the two transfers that I would expect to have the bigger year, just based on kind of what he's flashed so far.
So last year they brought in another freshman, and if you had told me, hey, a freshman's going to make some noise at UTSA, I would have said it was this guy, David Amador. How did he look in the spring?
Yeah, that's a good point. I did a story on him, and we were able to talk to him in the spring, and he was the guy that really threw the fall. And as early as signing day, it was highlighted as a guy that they thought could come in and play right away. And it was interesting. I think it was one of the first couple of drives of the season. They got him the ball on kind of a sweep play. So you understand that they saw some potential that with the ball in his hands, he can make some things happen and be kind of a dynamic threat for this offense. So we will see how that role sort of expands in his second year. I think there's certainly more wide receiver snaps available with the two guys that are gone, and he could end up being a guy who might factor in pretty well in the slot, where Joshua Cephas slid into that role for most of his career, even though at his size he profiles more as a perimeter guy, but just because they needed somebody who could sort of take that mantle. And maybe David Amador is the next kind of guy who can play that interior receiver role and make a big impact there. So I wouldn't be surprised to see him have a pretty big season. But to your point, yeah, it was maybe not all the production was all the way there last year, but I think you saw some of the reasons they were excited about him.
So come that the first game at home against Kennesaw State, who do you think are the starting receivers?
Yeah, it's really tough beyond McEwen. Like McEwen, I would say you can lock in as number one, and then after that, it could go any number of ways. If I had to guess right now, I think you will see Sparkman, just based on what he's flashed and the potential he has, and sort of offering a different profile, I think is important too. You probably want a more dynamic set of receivers rather than three guys with the same skill set. And then the third option, I think I'd go with Willie McCoy. I don't know if we talked about him much, but he had an injury scare last year where he was down on the field and ended up having to be stretchered off and was out for a few weeks until he came back in the bowl game. But they've talked a lot about him since he got here, of just the kind of dynamic threat he can bring as he was a return specialist in JUCO and had a lot of success there, and has flashed a little bit of that here, but certainly has the speed to make that work, and I think was developing as a receiver before the injury. So he, based on the overall picture of what we've seen from all the guys who were considering for that role, I think has the inside track to it. But that one could easily be, whether it's Chris Carpenter who emerges, another guy with that sprinter speed, or whether it ends up being Amador, or if it's DJ Allen or whoever else. There's a lot of guys who could factor in there.
So UTSA also returns a solid tight end group. Oscar Cardenas Houston Thomas and Dan Dishman. Last year, Cardenas ran the third most routes on the team and was fourth in targets, receptions, and yards. Should we expect the same type of usage for Cardenas in 2024, like we saw in 2023, or with the turnover at the quarterback position? And like you said, that wide receiver room is kind of ambiguous right now. Do we maybe see an increase in his role?
It's so funny because he's been around the program so long, Oscar has, and he has 82 catches and just shy of 1,000 yards in his career. But the way he comes through in big moments, I mean, he had a home on that highlight video, I think at least once or twice, that in these times where they really need a big catch, he's the guy who seems to come through with it. So you could convince some people he had 82 catches for 1,000 yards in any given season because it just feels so monumental a lot of the times. But he's a guy that's going to be super interesting to keep an eye on this year because I think as they got towards the end of last season, he was thinking about his NFL prospects and didn't necessarily like the reports he got back. You know, there were people talking about whether he might profile better as an offensive lineman or some kind of blocking role rather than feeling like he's a tight end who can make plays at the next level. And so we talked a lot through the spring about his efforts to get in better shape and maybe cut up to 20 pounds or so. And it seemed like he made really fast progress there. I don't know that we saw a lot on the field in the spring that was so wildly different, but the behind the scenes, they really rave about the progress he's made and the commitment that he's made to chasing that improvement. And so it'll be fascinating through the fall to see if he is able to sort of assert himself as a real receiving threat that translates into an NFL prospect, because that's obviously the goal at this stage in his career. And it's just something that hasn't necessarily materialized in a huge way, but he has the size and athleticism combination that's pretty rare that he certainly could get there. So I don't know if it's fair to expect more or less. He's probably going to want more in the offense, right? If that's what you're trying to prove. So we'll see if that's how it translates. It's probably just going to come down to how much that commitment to be in better shape and show more in that way holds through the summer and the fall when, you know, it's pretty easy right away to get inspired by something, but how does that carry into the real season? And can he live up to that potential that he feels like he has?
Let's move over to the offensive line. They bring back their left tackle, Vinley Tatafu, center Luke Lapizzi, and right guard Corey Godnett. But they do lose 4 offensive linemen in that room to graduation, 2 of which were starters, and left guard Terrell Haynes and right tackle Ernesto Alvarez. What do they do to kind of fill those losses along the offensive line?
Yeah, I don't envy you guys for having to try to figure out what this offensive line looked like the last couple of years, because it's really been all over the place. Whatever, 2 seasons in a row, it's whatever idea they thought they had coming into the season has ended up with 1 or 2 injuries that wasn't even necessarily just plug in the next guy. It was, we'll move this guy over here, and then we'll get this guy off the depth chart and put him over at that position, and you end up with a guy like Walker Beatty, who is a defensive tackle first and foremost, ends up moving over to the offensive line and trying to fill in on that side. And so it was all over the place. But I think the way to start looking at this year's offensive line, I think it centers around Mekhi Hart at right tackle, who has barely played the last 2 seasons, just like 2 games last year, and I think 2 games the year before that, but previously was an all-conference guy. And so he comes into the year at 25 years old, but he will be a guy that I think could be a starter and probably the best offensive lineman they have at tackle. So then everything else kind of falls into place from there, because you have at left tackle, we had a guy, Buffalo Cruz, that we talked to a lot about coming in here as a JUCO transfer and thought that he might be a big impact, but he dealt with some injuries and never really saw the field as much as might have been expected. So then that's how you end up with Vinley Tatafu, who was recruited as a guard and they thought he was going to play guard, and then 2 years ago had to move the tackle to fill in. Coming into last season, it's okay, we can put Vinley back at guard. He's going to be at his position that he wants to be in, and then more injuries and he's back out at tackle again. So at least right now, I think the plan once again is that finally he ends up at guard where he's supposed to be. And so then from there, you know, Luke Lopez was another guy that was filling in for an injury. Wasn't necessarily supposed to be the starting center last year. And I think bringing in CJ James from New Mexico will have a huge impact. I actually think, you know, he started at center in the spring game. I imagine that he will be that guy going into the fall as well. So really the only one that's probably going to be about what we were used to from last year to this year is Corey Godnett, who you mentioned at right guard. So if everything goes to form on paper, they have a very strong unit. It's just that the last couple of years, nothing has gone to form. Although that just makes them more and more prepared for when, if other situations pop up, they have guys who are ready to slide into different roles.
How did the unit look in the spring? Did they look like they were ready to, you know, protect the quarterback and open up the holes for the running back?
Well, you know, it was pretty much a shuffle as well because Mekhi Hart's not back yet. So it was an injury that's going to be keeping him out until at least kind of I think they said now was about the time they'd evaluate when he'd be ready to get back on the field. So they were still sort of shuffling and experimenting. And I think that's why we saw some different guys at tackle that maybe we hadn't seen before, whether it's guys they've recruited previously or transfers they brought in, like Kamar Missouri and Jalen Garth. Both have a chance to end up contributing depending how it works out. So I think it was still kind of a period of experimentation. They sort of, rather than thinking, let's get our 5 and try to build chemistry, especially with Makai out, it's let's just sort of experiment. And you would see different groups, different days, and different guys working at different spots. And so hard to say exactly how strong they looked because I think it was so much experimentation. But I think talent-wise and experience-wise, I think they're in a position where they could have a pretty good season.
If you had to pick an offensive player to have a breakout type season here in 2024, who would that be?
Yeah, I think the obvious one would be Devin McEwen, but it's sort of like cheating to pick the number 1 receiver and say he's going to have a big year. So I think the more under the radar guy would be Amador. I do think that it wouldn't be shocking if he ends up in a starting role, whether it's towards the end of the season or sooner. And I think they might find some other creative ways to get the ball in his hands because they're just sort of confident in what he can do and that he's going to make the smart play and protect the ball and all those little things that coaches love.
We talked a little bit about McEwen, but I mean, do you think that this season he'll kind of be be the wide receiver 1 and the potential 1,000-yard receiver for the Roadrunners?
Yeah, it's interesting because he's from East Texas. He played at Jacksonville High School, and Owen McCowan played at Rusk, which is also an East Texas school. And so they have kind of a connection. They work out over the summers and things like that. And so I feel like that could just add another layer to his sort of readiness to step up and contribute into that top role, to have some good chemistry with this probable starting quarterback. And so I think just from what he's capable of and what he's shown already and those connections, and I have a strong belief in the offensive system too. I think externally there's probably a lot of doubt about can this team produce at the same level without Frank Harris, but I think just the way it's schemed up and drawn up allows them to have a lot of success, and that maybe Owen McCown's arm talent might actually open up some other things that Frank Harris wasn't able to do. So I think they'll still probably produce at a pretty high level, so that should translate into a big year for the number 1 receiver.
All right, let's move over to the defensive side of the ball and talk about the guys up front along that defensive line. They're in pretty good shape there in terms of returning production. They bring back roughly 75% of that room. How did the defensive line look in the spring, and did anyone stand out?
Yeah, that group has for the last couple of years had a motto. They call it EBE, but it stands for Everybody Eats, because they take a lot of pride in being 3 deep at all 3 positions along that 3-man front. And they rotate through guys pretty evenly in terms of snap counts. And I don't think that this year is going to be any different. Even losing a couple talented guys in Brandon Matterson and Shumane Bell, they have a bunch of dudes back that they feel good about and that we've seen produce before. I think the number 1 guy to keep an eye on would be Joe Evans. I think he has a real chance to prove that he's an NFL talent and deserves a look at that level. The way he moves at 340 pounds is really impressive, and you see why he was originally recruited to LSU and might have had higher expectations than how everything ended up panning out that led him to land at UTSA. But you can't. I don't think you can go any farther without mentioning Brandon Brown, who's also been really, really solid at nose tackle for them for a couple of years, coming in as a transfer from Tulane. So I think that with those 2 guys sort of anchoring things, I think that group will be just as strong as it's been.
The linebacking group brought back roughly 60% of the room, but it took a big hit in the portal. They lost AAC Defensive Player of the Year Trey Moore to Texas and Avery Morris to New Mexico State. They do return Jamal Ligon, Martavius French, Danye Taylor, Jamorian Robinson, and others. They also bring in Brevin Randall from Louisiana Tech. How did the linebacking group look in the spring?
Yeah, inside linebacker is very, very solid. Jamal Ligon, who you mentioned, has a real shot to end his career as UTSA's all-time leading tackler. And it's funny because 2 years ago, he led the team in tackles. He had 83. And then last year, he was second on the team with 62. But I felt watching him, and I think the coaches echoed this as well, that he was one of the most improved players on the team, just from my eyes. And he made so many more kind of difference-making standout plays compared to some previous seasons where it felt like he was in the right spot to play within his assignment and make the tackles that came to him. But it felt like last year he was really making some difference-making plays that made a huge impact for this defense. And so they're really solid with him. And then Martavius French was a highly touted recruit who started at Tennessee and had a lot of talent every step of the way. And it started to materialize towards the end of his season here last year, kind of expanding his role more and more. And so it's going to be fascinating to see how Brevin Randall factors in there, because as we go through the spring, whichever players we talk to, I like to ask them, hey, who else on this team, any of the new guys have caught your eye, or who sort of had a strong spring? And more than any other name, Brevin Randall kept coming up again and again and again as a guy who was instantly a standout and looked like probably one of the stronger players on the defense. So I think that it'll be, they got 3 guys for 2 spots essentially, and that's without mentioning somebody like Kendrick Blackshire coming in here or Ian Jackson coming in here. And so that is going to be a room where they have a ton of guys who are capable of playing, and we'll just have to see who gets more snaps in a given game.
I mean, you just talked about Kendrick Blackshire coming over from Texas. What kind of role? Like, they have a pretty solid room there. You bring in somebody, from Texas. Sometimes you don't want to mess with that dynamic, but you also want to put the best talent out there. Like, how do you see him fitting into this rotation?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think at UTSA in general, not just any specific position, they have always rotated through so many guys, especially in the non-conference season, almost to a fault, where if you look at some of the non-conference losses they picked up last year, there might have been cases where it's just because they didn't have their best guys on the field all the time. Like, they really used that as a feeling out process to get a sense of who's going to be a contributor and who could have an impact through the conference season when it matters the most. So I think that we will see a lot of that experimentation continue. And so those guys who come in here, maybe behind the more established guys like Ligon and French, will really have a chance to prove themselves in live game situations. So it'll really be, and they're going to rotate, either way, but especially that early in the season, they'll have a chance to prove that they deserve to jump up the depth chart. So I couldn't even begin to speculate. I don't know a ton about Blackshire's game at this point, but it is going to be really interesting to see.
All right. So you lose the AAC Defensive Player of the Year in Trey Moore. How do you feel that role?
Yeah, it's impossible, right, to fill exactly the kind of production that he brought last year. It was kind of a record-setting season and the kind of talent that you don't see pass through here very often. And as a reminder of that, I don't know how much you guys have seen this, but some of the reports coming out of Texas this spring about how good he looked in camp and like people saying he could be one of the best players on the team is really underscores the extent to which UTSA was kind of out of their league with the level of talent that he brought to this program. And so really, they have another option there. I mean, Jamori Robinson was strong last season, kind of been playing the snaps that Trey wasn't in, and on passing downs, maybe they'd both be in there to get after the quarterback. I think he had maybe 4.5 sacks. And so he's a guy who could potentially step into a much larger role and have that production expand. Probably not to Trey's level, but to at least a level that you have a strong pass rusher you feel good about. And the other guy to keep an eye on is Nana Anyanwu. He was a JUCO transfer who they had high expectations for last year and had a ACL tear, I think, in the second game of the season. So we never really saw what he could do, but he's on his way back and potentially could be that second guy from that pass rushing outside linebacker spot who could make that kind of an impact.
Moving over to the defensive backfield, they lose a big-time leader and contributor in Rashad Wisdom. They also lose Kelechi Nwachukwu.
Yeah, Kelechi Nwachukwu.
Cam Alexander, Daiwan Griffin, Pig Cage, great name, by the way, and Nick Troy Fortune. But they do return leading tackler Ken Robinson, Elliott Davison, Marcellus Wilkerson, among others. They bring in Jamarius Lewis and Zach Morris from New Mexico, Denver Harris from LSU, and Jimmy Wyrick from Stanford. Jimmy Wyrick doesn't come in until, I guess, sometime this summer. But kind of how did that defensive backfield shape up in the spring?
So the safety position you can feel really good about if you're UTSA because Elliott Davison and Ken Robinson both played a lot last year. I think they're prepared to do even more. Davison has kind of stepped into Wisdom's old position at the boundary safety, which leaves Ken Robinson to play more of the field role where I think he's more comfortable. And so I think that they are both in good position to contribute and keep that safety production at the same high level it's been. And if they're able to get Wyrick or Lewis to come in and contribute right away, then that's even better. I don't think they have to worry about that spot. But as a contrast, I think corner is more up in the air than any other position group on this team. They've lost their top 3 guys there. And so what you're looking at then is a guy like Zay Frazier as a returner who when he signed here, he was a flip from Kentucky and he was one of the more heralded recruits that they've ever brought in, but has not really been able to put it together on the field yet. Last year, it was a strange kind of academic issue that was really more of a miscommunication with compliance than anything else, but it kept him off the field for a large chunk of the season. And so we're yet to see what he can do. Cyrus Dumas was a guy who came in here highly touted, and I think he entered the transfer portal, and then I believe he removed himself from the transfer portal just recently as well. So maybe he can live up to the potential that they thought they had when they signed him. But then really all eyes are on the transfers. Zach Morris started in the spring game. It seemed like he was prepared to take on that kind of a role. And then Denver Harris is a name that we've talked about as much as any other guy, because he comes in here with so much talent and hype, and he was a former five-star guy or near five-star guy who played at A&M and LSU, and it's just a matter of if he can put that together into that level of production on a college football field for the first time in his career, really. So it remains to be seen how that shakes out, and I wouldn't be surprised at all to see one or even two more guys get added to that room before the season starts, because I think that's where they need the most help. So it's really anybody's guess at this point who works out from that room.
Did anyone kind of step up into Wisdom's leadership role or his actual, role in the defensive backfield there? Or
yeah, it's a great question, because from the X's and O's standpoint, that's kind of Elliot Davison's role now. He's comfortable with the run responsibilities that Wisdom brought to the table. But I think the leadership is something that I would flag from all sides of this team, because Frank Harris and Rashad Wisdom were those guys, and the people who are now tabbed as the leaders are not the same type of vocal presences that those guys were. Defense, you have less of a problem there, because Danye Taylor is one guy who it's hard to not hear him. He's pretty vocal on the field, and I think he can get the guys going in that way with some of that rah-rah kind of stuff. But generally, and Cyrus Simon, one of the defensive ends who we didn't mention in that section, is also that kind of a guy. So they have maybe some voices there, but if something is missing from this team, I would say it's going to be that leadership component, because they have guys who are more quiet leaders. And so we'll see how the rest of the group responds to maybe a different approach in that way.
All right, Greg, if you have to pick a defensive player to have a breakout type season here in 2024, who are you picking?
This one was tough. I thought about this for a while, and I was looking at the roster and snap counts from last season and who could step forward. And I think I settled on Jamori Robinson, but it's based more on the opportunity and the need for him to do that than anything. There's been little things in the past that have sort of held him back. Like it's like stuff you would never expect. Like a couple times he's been whistled for just lining up off sides, like 2 or 3 times in the course of a season. And it's stuff maybe those things that you just tighten up some of that stuff, and then you play to the level that you flashed at different times, and he could put together a season where he is deserving of being that top pass rusher that they really need if they're going to be a dynamic defense.
Now that spring practice is over, which position group or groups do you feel is the most concerning?
Yeah, it's corner 100%, like we just talked about. I think the guys who are there are either unproven and kind of inexperienced, or just transfers, and it remains to be seen how well they adapt to the system and the culture, or guys who aren't on the roster yet. And so it was fascinating in the spring that they only really had, I think, 5 scholarship guys on campus. And even one of them was playing with one of those clubs on his hand. He was playing through a broken hand or wrist or something of that nature. So they really didn't have a ton of healthy guys at that position. And when they would go through the drills, you could tell just how light it was over there and how that rotation was very thin. So that's one where we're really going to have to wait and see who UTSA is able to land, or who really steps up into that role. But that's the number one thing to keep an eye on in terms of who are going to be the guys.
So they brought in a ton of transfers here in the last week or so. You just mentioned that cornerback, maybe another one where they're looking to bring some more folks in. Is there another position they might be looking to add through the portal?
Yeah, well, they settled up the quarterback need, which was the last other big one that we were looking at. And other than that, I'd say, like you mentioned, running back was one they'd highlighted and they've solved it. Safety, they highlighted and they've solved it. So all the checklist of things they wanted to hit, they've hit all of them. It's just cornerback, I think, is the only one that's left. And then, of course, I do think that they kind of leave some space where if somebody who, maybe they played in the area, or some super talented guy who just ends up in the portal and wants to be here for whatever reason, like, I don't think they close off roster space for that sort of thing. They're prepared for any kind of exceptional circumstance that might pop up. But in terms of positional needs, I do think corner is really the only one left.
So what would you say is the main strength of this team?
This is kind of, I don't know if this is like too easy of an answer, if this is against the rules, but I would honestly say coaching, because all of the stuff that people talk about with, culture and all these, the talking points that a lot of these different coaches have really ring true here with Jeff Traylor. And as well as anything else, it explains why this team's been able to have so much more success than the program had previously. They've all just really bought in, and you see it when you look at the transfer portal and the amount of guys that have stayed here when they probably could have had other options. You see a certain amount of guys every year leave, but certainly they have not been hit as hard as a lot of other programs in terms of that, and they've done a decent job of retention. And from an X's and O's standpoint, I think these coaches tend to always have these guys in a pretty good scenario. And I can't remember in a couple years a game where they got the worst of some pretty significant halftime adjustments. Like they usually handle that part of the game pretty well too. So that's why when I say I think the offense will be all right without Frank Harris, I think a lot of it is that coaching component, because I think they just put the guys in good spots and they have a system that works and that everyone understands and believes in. And so I really think when people are talking about, well, how good is this team going to be next year without Frank Harris and Rashad Wisdom, I think that's the part that might be easy to overlook, because I think they just have a really solid foundation with the staff to maintain success as the roster turns over.
All right, so it's a game day. You get an alert. It says, hey, there's a flu bug going through the locker room, and you immediately think, oh, I hope it's not this position. Or you're not, or I guess let me say, you're not concerned that it's this position. How do you look at the strength of that position if we put it in terms like that?
Oh, like which one could best survive having the top couple guys taken off? Yeah, I think it's running back for the reasons that we talked about earlier, with having three guys who are in good standing and they're ready to go. But then on top of that, knowing that you have a couple of transfers who have a lot of potential as well, that's the number one spot where I would say if you take a hit there, you're going to be all right. And then after that, there's other positions you feel good about, but it's more speculative, like whether it's safety, like we talked about, or inside linebacker, where we know we have some solid guys in the picture who have produced before, but then also behind that, there's new guys who show potential, or we think that they could step up to that level. From that perspective, I think UTSA should feel pretty good about it. But the one where you're replacing a proven guy with another proven guy would really be the running back spot or the defensive line.
So when it comes to recruitment of new players and then retention of existing players, how has the NIL and transfer portal impacted UTSA? Obviously, we've seen like the negative and positive in terms of it leaving, players leaving and then players coming in. But fundamentally, has it changed how they've done things, or maybe they look at things differently now?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think it's had to change things for everybody. But I think as much as any coach is in the new era, I think Jeff Traylor is really kind of relationship driven with his recruiting. So, Jeff Traylor's first coaching job was at Jacksonville. And so that's how he is able to bring in and retain a player like Devin McEwen, who certainly probably had offers to go to a Power 5 school and potentially make some more NIL money and play at that level if he wanted to. So he leans on those relationships a lot. And so as much as that was like the whole bread and butter of recruiting previously, there's at least some impact of that still being able to help retain guys or land guys who might otherwise not come here. And when you look at the way the transfer portal impacts every G5 school, UTSA has really only lost a few guys the last couple of years. They lost Trey Moore, who we talked about. Cam Alexander, the cornerback, went to Oregon, and Zachary Franklin, the wide receiver, went to Ole Miss. But outside of that, they've been able to keep most of their key players. A lot of the guys who transfer outside of that group are for their own. They might think they have more opportunity to play somewhere else, so they weren't as much of a key guy here as they might have wanted to be. So, and then you look at the guys who they have brought in, Cam Alexander came in as a transfer, right? So without the whole portal environment, he never would have been here to begin with. And then Nick Fortune, Elliott Davison, Martavius French, Brandon Brown, Joe Evans, Rocco Griffin, even Owen McCown, transfer from Colorado. These are all guys who have contributed here in big ways or will continue to contribute here in big ways. And then how many guys did we already talk about, whether it's there could be as many as 5 starters who came in this year as transfers, whether it's Sparkman or DJ Allen or Brevin Randall or Zach Morris or Denver Harris, or, the list goes on and on. CJ James, I mentioned, I think is probably a projected starter on the offensive line. So they've had a lot of guys from the portal that have benefited them as much or more than they've been hurt by it.
It seems more and more that the demands of a head coach are really turning into more of a general manager type role between the recruiting, player retention, fundraising, and less of the X's and O's. What do you see happening there at UTSA?
Yeah, I think it's probably similar to what you see a lot of other places. Jeff Traylor hasn't made it much of a secret, and I think it's probably fair to say it's a little bit annoying just how much you have to worry about fundraising and paying attention to the NIL component. It used to always be facilities, right? And that was it. We had to worry about how you get these facilities up to par, and that's what kept you competitive in recruiting and nationally as your program. And they've been trying to get a covered practice field built since the day he got here. It was part of an overall plan for an operations center with a locker room and practice fields and all that. And that building came together, and that's what they operate out of now. But the covered practice field component was part of the budget cuts. So we still talk a lot about that indoor stadium or the indoor practice facility and what that would do on some of these hot days down in South Texas. And that's a work in progress. Fundraising for that has kind of taken a backseat to some of the other projects that they have in mind for some of the other sports. So it remains to be seen when that'll ever come together. And I don't know who doesn't want more NIL money. I think everybody's after that. UTSA seems to be in a decent spot relative to their peers in the group of 5. They have 3 collectives, 2 that are sort of high-level donor types, and then one that's a little more grassroots for any fan who kind of wants to contribute to whether it's baseball or softball or, some of the sports that don't get as much love. So the infrastructure is okay from that point. And, it was an interesting conversation around the time that UTSA went from Conference USA to the American in the last couple of years, because generally, if you just look at their budgets and how it all stacks up to the other programs in this league, they're not near the top. They're closer to the bottom in terms of just what they spend on football and different aspects of the athletic department. But we've seen that in the last couple of years really expand in a big way. Last year was the first year their overall athletics department budget was over $50 million, which is, it doesn't stack up to anywhere close to some of these Power 5 programs, but on a G5 level, that puts you in a much better spot, and it makes them more and more competitive within the league. So they now have some recruiting staff that they've brought in this year that they've never had before. So these assistant coaches are doing a little bit less multitasking. The nutrition component they're addressing a little bit more comprehensively. And, it may sound like a small thing, but they've really stepped up their creative department in the last year or two, because when you're talking about building a brand and what that means for recruiting, having that kind of content out there for people really goes a long way. So there are all these little levels that they're trying to reach and that they're trying to bring up to par in this new league. And it's just taking steps and steps and steps. And I'm sure Jeff Traylor would rather be more focused on football, but he's done a good job of bringing those things along and pushing for what he needs to push for and being able to fundraise what he needs to fundraise to just get on that trajectory. But he would be the first to tell you that they're not all the way there yet to where they want to be.
So the last 2 seasons have been pretty successful years for the Roadrunners. The 2024 season's over. What has to happen for you and UTSA fans to look back on it and say, hey, this season was a success?
Yeah, so it's interesting to look at. They put out the over-under win totals pretty recently, and UTSA is at 8.5 in Vegas, and the over actually pays better than the under, so there's less people sort of expecting that to be the way things go. And when you look at the schedule, which is a lot of what this comes down to sometimes, they should lose to Texas, and they have a home date against Memphis. That'll be tough. They play at Texas State, which is probably like a coin flip, and really they should be favored in every other game on the schedule. It doesn't mean you're going to win all of those, but especially if you get a good payout, I feel like taking the over and getting this team to 9-3 is probably a pretty good path. But in terms of, narratively, like how people are going to react to it, they have consistently set the expectations of being close to the championship level based on what they've accomplished here, winning back-to-back Conference USA titles a couple years ago, and just how how competitive they were the first year in the new league. So I think that expectation remains the same, but in terms of how people are going to react if they end up having a bad season for whatever reason, I feel like they're in a pretty good spot regardless. Jeff Traylor's built up so much goodwill here that even if they stumble to 7-5 or something like that, I don't think it'll set off any alarms. We'll talk about how every year is not a great year, and life after Frank Harris, and resource-wise, it's still a growing program, and they were probably ahead of schedule and things like that. So I don't think that they're under a ton of pressure to deliver this year, but they keep the expectations as high as ever. So I feel like as a program, they're in a pretty good spot in that sense.
All right, Greg, is there anything else that you think we should know about this 2024 UTSA Roadrunners football team that we did not cover?
Yeah, we touched on it a bit earlier. I was glad we brought up the point about Rashad Wisdom and the leadership, but I think that applies to the offensive side too. If this season goes sideways for whatever reason, I think that leadership component is probably what we'll hear about, and it'll become one of the narratives around the team, just because for so many years, Frank Harris and Rashad Wisdom have clearly been those guys. So the people who are stepping into those roles now have to do different things from that leadership perspective than they've ever had to do before. And those guys just aren't the loudest voices. They aren't the most talkative. And so maybe there are times where that component is missing. And if something goes wrong, they don't have the same force to sort of rally. More of it would fall on the coaches than being a player-led kind of team. So I think for a team that talks as much as they do about the culture and the mentality, it will be really interesting to see who sort of emerges in that way and what impact that whole arrangement has.
Well, thank you again, Greg, for sharing your time and knowledge with us today. We greatly appreciate it.
Of course, it was awesome to do it. Thank you guys so much. Maybe we'll be back next year.
Absolutely. Hey, if you are watching us on YouTube, please hit that like and subscribe button. And if you are listening to us in podcast form, please leave a rate and review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Thank you all for your support. And until the next time, we are the G5 Hive.